And now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Shauna Gordon-McKeon, a woman who wears many hats. She's a community activist, a Java programmer, a Python programmer, PHP if she has to, a data scientist, a writer, a free software community activist for Open Hatch. She also works on civic tech and open science. If there's something she doesn't do, it's probably not worth doing. So here she is, Shauna Gordon-McKeon. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here today with you. I'm a little nervous. It's my first keynote, but I've been nervous before, giving my first talk, teaching my first workshop, making my first major contribution to a project, and it's all worked out before, so I'm assuming it'll work out today. I was invited to give this talk about 8 months ago, and I was asked to talk about how newcomers could get started contributing to projects and how projects could make themselves more welcoming to newcomers. And I said, yes, of course. I spent about 2 years as a part-time director for Open Hatch, which is a nonprofit that tries to help people get more involved in free software. And I've spent a lot of time and talked to a lot of people, newcomers and old-timers, seasoned professionals, and passionate volunteers. Learned about a lot of projects, heard a lot of war stories. So I've got a lot of advice to give and a lot of stories to tell, and I could stand up here all day talking about that. But I've only got an hour, and as I sat down to write, I realized that I wanted to talk about something a little bit different. Yeah, there are a lot of projects out there, a lot of individual projects, and a lot of ways to contribute to them. But I want to talk about the ways that you can contribute to the free software project, the community as a whole. This wonderful group that we've got here and around the world. And so I want to talk about some of the open issues in the free software project, to the ongoing problems that we're still working on, and all of the people who are tackling those things. To me, these are the greatest opportunities for contribution, the most interesting and exciting and potentially impactful. This talk is a bug report. I'm going to highlight some meta problems, and maybe when the talk is over, you'll want to add to the report. Be like, yeah, I sure could replicate that. Maybe you'll say, let's defer this until later when we're ready to work on it. And you may even say, I don't think this is a bug, I think it's a feature. You'll label it as won't fix and move on. I hope you won't do that, but that's okay. My purpose here is really just to articulate these issues so that once we've articulated them, we can start addressing them or continue addressing them. This bug report is not meant to discourage anyone. It's not meant to be a criticism of the community or say it's broken and not worth contributing to. On the contrary, it is an act of affection. It is a way of saying that this project, the free software project, is beautiful and valuable and, like all things, imperfect, and I want to work on making it better. So I'm going to begin by telling you a bit about myself. Long before I was a free software contributor or a programmer at all, I was a moral psychologist. What does this mean? In college and for a few years after, I looked at moral behaviors, altruism, cooperation, aggression, punishment, and I studied them using a variety of different methods. I studied monkeys. I collected vials of people's spit and analyzed them for hormone levels. And then I stuck people in giant magnets to see how their brain looked like when they were thinking about their values. It's an example of a giant magnet. It was the giant magnets that got me into free software, actually, in a roundabout sort of way. It turns out that fMRI generates a ton of data, and in order to process and analyze this data, I had to learn how to program. And so my very first programming language is MATLAB. You may know that MATLAB is not a free software project. It is whatever the opposite of a free software project is. It is neither free in speech or free as in beer. In fact, it can cost up to $2,000 for a license. So when I decided to leave academia, I had to leave MATLAB behind. And I also felt as though I was leaving my ability to contribute to science behind. Over time, I discovered free software science projects like Octave, SciPy, and I discovered open science communities like the Center for Open Science. And in fact, I'm currently one of many authors on a collaborative science project paper that's in submission right now, in which I used a bunch of free software projects like SciPy, R, the IPython project, and the Open Science Framework. So that's a part of my free software origin story, my path up to this stage. But it also tells you a bit about how I view the world. I look at the world and I see values. When I look at people, I wonder what values motivate them. And when I see a conflict, I think, what shared values do the people in this conflict have that can help us resolve it? Free software to me is not just a bunch of hardware and software, but a system of people and the values that motivate them. Beneath the code, the heart. So maybe you don't think this is a useful way of looking at the world. That's totally fine, but you're stuck with it for the duration of this talk. I'm curious, before we continue, are there any values that people in the audience have that really resonate with them and draw them to free software?
Collaboration.
Collaboration?
Freedom.
Freedom. Freedom of speech?
Privacy.
Privacy?
The ability to modify something you want to modify without someone telling you what to do.
Short version is the ability to modify things.
And collaboration to modify things to build on what others have done before, so you don't have to start from scratch. You just keep making everything better.
Yeah, building on what others have done before. If you can just shout really loud in the back.
Yeah, just go off what he was saying. User empowerment.
User empowerment. Kindness, yes, absolutely. Democracy.
Not paying money for things.
Not paying money for things. Being able to figure out what's wrong when something goes wrong. I thought about this for a while and came up with the 4 most important values to me for free software, and that's empowerment. The empowerment, as a lot of people were saying, of being able to understand what's going wrong, make changes. The commons, the sort of shared creation, whether that's a piece of software or if it's like the shared project of understanding the world through science, which is a big one for me. The connections that you make with individuals in the community when you work together, the act of giving to one another. And openness, not actually even that much about the openness of code, but the openness of the community. I thought when I left science that I just was not going to be able to do science, but because I found the open science community and the free software scientific community, I found people who didn't care whether or not I was affiliated with an institution and were happy to consider my contributions on their own terms. There's another reason, skipped ahead. To get back to the bug report metaphor, I've just told you a bit about how I operate, my operating system, what kind of dependencies I'm using. In science, we'd call that a confound. In politics, maybe we'd call it a bias. Dependencies, confounds, biases, they're all inevitable. What's important is to talk about them and to make them explicit so that you know that they're there and so that you can change them if you need to, or you can work on changing them. There's another reason I'm telling you this origin story, and that's because the first bug report I'm going to make, it's been a problem for me from the very beginning. This is kind of small, so I'll read it out loud. Bug report number 1, the expected behavior. Communities whose values overlap with free software will use free software. Actual behavior. Only small pockets of these communities seem to be aware of and use free software. I made my first free software contribution in 2011. It was to a small project that was being run by Mako Hill, some of you may know, he lives in the area. I sent him an email that said, you should make a change on this line, or change this number on this line of this file, which is in this directory. And he obstinately refused to do that. He was like, you need to submit a patch. And I was like, what's a patch? So he walked me through the whole process, and it was good fun. Except it was also kind of sad, because why was I learning about this from Mako in 2011, when I should have been learning about it from my science professors 7 years before? That's the better part of a decade when I could have been contributing to free software and doing open science. And I wasn't, because I didn't really know that it existed. The scientific community is hardly the only community that one might expect to embrace free software that is not quite there yet. For several years, I've been involved in the open government movement, also called the transparency movement or civic tech. It's a bunch of folks who are pushing for accountability and transparency in government, and they do by and large embrace FOSS. And they're a growing movement, but they're still somewhat small, and so only a small fraction of political activists and public officials really know about and embrace free software. Libraries are yet another group. I don't know too much about libraries. I'm mostly just an enthusiastic patron. But I'm friends with several librarians, and they tell me that with the exception of a few free software projects related to ILS, integrated library systems, whatever those are, for the most part, libraries run on proprietary software, which is heartbreaking, because when you think about libraries, their role in our society is to share information and to empower individuals through the sharing of that information. And so I think that every librarian should be a free software advocate, and every free software advocate should be a little bit in love with libraries. But yet there's this disconnect. So I've defined a problem here. People who should be using free software aren't. What can we do about it? So this is obviously a complex issue which differs from group to group, and there are a number of contributing factors. For instance, in the sciences, there's for-profit publishers which dampen openness in many forms. There's a pressure to not be scooped. In government, there's these procurement processes that I've heard are a nightmare. There's all these political issues involved. So there's a variety of different elements at play. And there are a number of excellent organizations that are working on this. Once again, this is very small, so I'll just call out a couple of them. There's the scientific Python community, SciPy, NumPy, Pandas, Matplotlib. I've contributed a couple of times to SciPy. They're a wonderful, welcoming community. I highly recommend them. There's the Software Carpentry Group. This is a group that goes around to universities and colleges and provides workshops to teach scientists about technical tools like version control, databases, things like that, and they're big free software proponents. Another favorite of mine is the Public Lab, a citizen science group that does open source free software and hardware and engages people to do scientific research on the world around them, to look at poisoning or toxicity in soil and in water. They've done balloon mapping of oil spills, lots of really cool stuff going on. In the civic tech sphere, there's the Sunlight Foundation. They try to make data about the government available. They take these, they funnel through from the source from the government source, which is not always in the best format for intake, and make these really lovely APIs out of them, and they do that all with free software. In libraries, there's a group called FOSS for Lib, and there's a bigger group that does it called Code for Lib. The open ILS systems I was talking about before, Koha and Evergreen. And so there's many other groups which I haven't mentioned, which are also working in this sphere. I want to take a moment, though, to look at this from a values-based perspective, like I warned you I would. So the reason why I expect that scientists, political activists, librarians would all be using free software is because I see them as sharing the same values as free software advocates. Openness, love of shared knowledge, a desire to empower the individual. So are there other values that we're prioritizing differently that are causing some alienation? And I think there are. So the first one I want to talk about is usability. So the free software community has a disproportionate number of programmers and developers in it compared to the general population. And because we're familiar with software, we have a higher threshold for ability to use difficult tools. Whereas people like scientists, librarians, and government officials, despite being brilliant and hardworking, they only have so much time in the day and so much space in their brains. And so just as the average software contributor might want to be able to read a science news headline and understand and trust that news without having to go to the primary research article or even to the data to analyze it for themselves, a scientist wants a program that they can just use without having to spend a long time reading documentation or debugging like an installation process. Software with poor usability is not merely impractical, it's alienating because it implies that the people who are using the tools, their time isn't as important, that the work of researching diseases or helping a patron find the resources they need are not as valuable as the time they could be spending debugging and reading documentation. Now, over time, the free software community has come to do a lot of work on usability. I'm not meaning to imply that no one cares about usability, but I would love to see more spreading around of some of the great tools and processes that people have done. So, for instance, Deb Nicholson, a couple years ago at LibrePlanet, did something which she called SpinachCon, which is when she got together a bunch of project leads and users and had them do a usability sprint. And heard great things from that. But Deb, was there ever a follow-up SpinachCon?
Not yet.
Not-
There may yet be one.
I happen to think there should be tons of follow-up SpinachCons. No pressure on you personally, but the community as a whole should be doing these usability sprints, which are not that much work. At Open Source Bridge a couple of years ago, I saw a talk by Jen Davidson doing what's called Think Aloud, which is when you take a project maintainer and someone who's completely new to the project, and the person who's completely new to the project just starts trying to do a task while just saying aloud what they're thinking, where they're getting stuck. They might be like, get to a point and be like, wow, I have no idea what to do next. This button isn't doing what I think it should be doing. And then the maintainer is right there and able to take those notes and make those fixes. So this is something that can take 15 minutes. It's also a great way to involve newcomers in your project, because in fact, a newcomer, someone who has never seen the project before, is the absolute best person to do this. So it's a way to improve the usability of your project and also to help familiarize newcomers with your project. So a win-win. Another value which I think is worth talking about is privacy. There are a number of free software projects which practice radical openness, which is cool in its own right, but I think it's important to talk about where privacy and openness intersect and sometimes come into conflict with each other. When I was a neuroscience researcher, I did almost entirely human subject research, except for when I was working with the monkeys. And I collected a lot of very sensitive personal data. And as much as I would have loved to be able to share that data, as much as it would have helped the great human project of science, I couldn't. And that's for a very good reason. And you see this tension also with government data. There are kinds of government data which citizens should absolutely have the right to. But there's other government data, for instance, census data, health data, tax data that gets collected, that should remain private. There's some interesting approaches to this particular conflict. One of my favorite is Open Humans, formerly known as the Personal Genome Project, where they ask participants to voluntarily give their data to the public. And in return, the researchers who use this data make a promise to engage with the participants, to explain their research, and to basically treat them with sort of respect as partners in the process, which I think it's fantastic. That being said, that's just one relatively small project in the whole great realm of science, so it's not a panacea. I actually think that when it comes to protecting individuals from invasive monitoring, the free software community has been a real champion in this space. Free software projects like Tor, GPG, CryptoCat, Privacy Badger, just to name a few. There are successful, vital projects which this community has created. I talked to Alison Macrina, founder of the Library Freedom Project. I guess I'll read this one out too, because it's kind of small. While it's important that people don't overtrust their software and recognize that all software has the potential to be compromised, FOSS is by definition the only software that can help you resist surveillance. Since the source code is shared openly, it becomes much harder for a malicious actor, like a government intelligence agency, to insert a backdoor. I would rather put my trust in a community of relatively like-minded people who value transparency, privacy, and freedom, rather than black box software from companies that have already violated our trust and our rights. So I think this is a great articulation of just how well openness and privacy can work together. But Nevertheless, privacy through openness is not exactly an intuitive idea, and it's not enough to create these projects for people who already grasp that idea, for people who are from this community. And so actually privacy-focused projects have put a great deal of effort into making their tools more usable. Allison, who runs the Library Freedom Project, teaches librarians about surveillance threats and the tools that can combat them. She also pointed out to me that the Tor project runs regular usability sprints and that they hired a communications director who came from an activist background. And every month, just a few blocks down from me, there's a crypto party. In some ways, those focused on individual privacy represent the best of free software outreach efforts. And they've put a lot of effort into making their tools usable and their cause understandable. And I want people to feel this way about free software in general. I want them to know that we care about this issue, we recognize the issue, and that our cheerleading for openness is not going to shout down our concerns about privacy. A third value, which I think slows the adoption of free software in other spaces, is education. In science, in government, in a lot of spaces, there's a lot more emphasis put on structured education and methods of learning. There are classes to take, textbooks to read, teachers to mentor you. There are clear paths of advancement, and in free software, we've got less of that. Which brings me to my next bug report. Bug report number 2. Expected behavior. People with interest in free software and a willingness to work hard will be able to find a place contributing to the community. Actual behavior. Despite their interests, many people get frustrated and give up on contributing. I spent a goodly portion of the last 2 years focusing on this issue, and I've got a lot to say about it, rather too much to say, so I'm going to put most of that in references at the end of the talk that you can follow through if you're interested. I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version, which is that a lot of people want to contribute and don't, or they'll contribute a couple of times and not continue on. There are a number of practical hurdles, and some of these hurdles are poorly specified development environments and setup processes, newcomer unfamiliarity with communication tools and cultural norms, and issues sitting in trackers that just rely too much on the implicit familiarity and knowledge of the project and how the project works that newcomers just can't access. I'll give you a couple of practical solutions. This is an image from an Open Hatch workshop at Purdue University a couple years ago. There was a group of students who wanted to contribute to a project who spent basically 3 hours during our free-form contributions period just trying to get the project set up. And I remember we asked them for feedback about what their experience had been like and to list the obstacles they faced, and there were like dependencies you weren't aware of. We had to sign up for an account. There were tiers clouding our vision. So they had a lot of fun. Not everyone has a ton of fun trying to set up a development environment that takes several hours. And actually there's a happy ending to the story, because when we wrote about it on our blog, the good people of Privly, who the project was for, read the blog and they were like, oh, we should work on our setup process. So I think they opened and closed something like 11 or 17, some prime number of bugs in the space of a day. And when I heard about this gave me the idea for setup sprints, where you take a potential new contributor and you take a project maintainer and you have them try to install the project, and they just, as the problems come up, you just give them and feed them directly to the maintainer. It's a lot like a Think Aloud in certain ways. So that's one practical solution. Another solution that I came up with to the problem of not knowing how to use communication tools or cultural norms is WelcomeBot. WelcomeBot is a bot that can sit in your IRC channel, and if someone new, not on the list of known nicknames, comes into the channel and no one talks for a period of time, default is 60 seconds, the bot will welcome them. They'll say, hey, I'm a bot, no one's around. It pings channel regulars. It gives you an email address or some other way to get in touch, and basically says, hey, thanks for coming, we like you. If you didn't know, here's all these other ways to get in touch and ways to think about how IRC works. So those are two practical solutions, but let's forgo practical solutions for a moment and talk about values again. I want to talk about 2 ways of approaching this issue. The first is respecting the skill of teaching. Teaching is a lot like coding. Both are activities which require effort and thoughtfulness to improve. They're skills that some people will have naturally, more naturally than others, and some people have more interest in than others. And they're activities that most people ought to try at least once, arguably. In our society, coding as a skill is associated with men and masculinity, and teaching has been gendered as feminine. And I think this is part of the reason why teaching has been relatively devalued compared to coding in free software, which hurts everybody. People who want to teach are often given neither the resources or training they need to do well, whereas other people who are not that interested in teaching nevertheless feel that, oh, anyone should be able to teach, and are kind of confused as to why this seems to be so hard. A year or so ago, I had the maintainer of a software project ask me for my advice. She was having this issue where people were constantly coming up to her and offering her help with her project, but it was never actually the help she needed. And a lot of times, in order to be able to contribute to her project, they would need a lot of mentorship and to be taught a number of tools. And that just wasn't her priority at the moment. And so I said to her, it sounds like these people are just not a good fit for you. There's nothing wrong with politely rejecting an offer of help. Not every free software project needs to be welcoming to newcomers. And in fact, you're doing people a favor by releasing them and helping them to go find a project where there are people who are actively interested in mentoring and have designed and worked towards making their projects more accessible. And I think that's a good general thing to understand, that it's okay to have a free software project with a contributor base of 1. It's okay to have a project that plainly states the standards for contributions and says we don't have time to help you meet those standards, but we will accept your contributions if they do meet these standards. Education is it's a task that takes time and energy and skills that not everyone has, just like coding. By actively valuing education, we can help make sure that the people teaching actually want to be teaching. There are a number of organizations that support teaching FOSS contribution. The biggest of these is Google Summer of Code. What I like about Google Summer of Code is that they explicitly pay mentors, valuing that teaching role. There's also Outreachy. I love Outreachy. It's smaller and not funded by a giant tech corporation, but it also allows people to get paid for doing non-coding work for projects, including teaching. There's also Project Ascend. Project Ascend has run once and will hopefully run again. It works with underemployed participants, so focusing on people who really need paid internships. There are a number of other FOSS workshops and programs. There's a link to these slides, so even if you can't see all of them, if you're interested in these things, you can just visit the slides later. The other thing I want to talk about as regards to education is the myth of the self-taught programmer. You may have heard this one before. I hear it a lot. I've had people come up to me at conferences and sort of somewhat aggressively say, oh, we don't need this education and outreach. The people that you get through education and outreach are incompetent, lazy people. So I find this insulting. But beneath the insult, I think that there's actually a value there, and it's a value that I share, which is the desire that the people in the community be empowered, that they feel a sense of self-sufficiency and an ability to understand different projects, to gain knowledge, to help each other. People who see an obstacle and feel this desire to tackle it. So in this way, the people that come up and say this to me, I'm like, yeah, we come from the same place, but we go to a completely different place, because their model of self-sufficiency is a narrow one. It fits only a certain type of person. One person who's written and talked a lot about this is Melchua. She talks a lot about learning styles. So for an example, one kind of spectrum of learning is active versus reflective. And programming and FOSS tend to favor an active learning style. So an active learner is one who likes to dive into things, to think about things out loud, to just try stuff, and as they try stuff, they gather information, and they're like, oh, I run into an obstacle, let me try this thing. Whereas a reflective learner is more the kind of person who will like take a step back, try to understand the system as a whole before diving in. And so reflective learners might have a harder time fitting into free software. I consider myself to be kind of a reflective learner. Sometimes when I ask for help in an IRC channel and someone mentions a word I don't know, I'm like, be right back, gotta read a 10,000 word essay about what this means and how it fits into my overall model of this project. The ability to say that, the self-confidence and self-knowledge, comes from getting comfortable in this space and from talking to people like Mel. And it's not something that all newcomers can do. Mel is also an accessibility advocate. She writes, what might be accessible to one group might not work for another, and we aren't always thoughtful about how to make things more available to everyone. For instance, how many of our programs are screen reader friendly for the blind and low vision community? How many times do non-native English speakers get left out of meetings or silenced during conversations because we don't pause for them to keep up? The FOSS learning model also privileges people with the resource to experiment. Kate Voss calls this the privilege of breaking things. There are people who can't take the chance of accidentally breaking their computer for a few days, or who can't afford to void the warranty by jailbreaking or rooting their phone. When we embrace self-sufficiency in all of its forms, we open up new opportunities for community growth. It's not simply that a greater number and variety of people can participate. By actively teaching self-sufficiency, we empower all members of our communities to contribute in new and better ways. In other words, telling a newbie to read the bleeping manual, you point them in the right direction and maybe alienate them forever. But teach a newbie how to read the bleeping manual, and you've taught them how to find their own directions. And maybe, just maybe, next week when someone else asks for something that's on that page, the newcomer will speak up and teach that even newer newcomer how the project works, how to read the documentation. I've seen this happen in positive learning environments, for instance, at outreach workshops and in places like the Open Hatch IRC channel. So how do we go about this? We can explicitly say that we value self-sufficiency, persistence, independence of thought, and we can teach the skills in practical ways, showing newcomers how to read documentation, how to ask good questions, how to estimate just how likely something is to break their computer. I have some suggested phrases. If you've ever seen me give a talk before, I love suggested phrases. I'm not going to read them out, but if this all sounds interesting to you, I suggest that you go find my slides and look at the suggested phrasing. Of course, teaching these skills requires putting some effort into your work as a teacher, and so these two elements, both self-sufficiency and valuing teaching, go hand in hand. On to the next bug report. Money. Expected behavior. Everyone is able to contribute to FOSS without suffering financial hardship. Actual behavior. The FOSS contributor base is largely one of economic privilege, and many people who contribute do so while struggling financially. There's been a fair amount of debate about compensation and payment for free software, which is hardly surprising. Money is one of the most contentious topics there is, and if the wider world has not figured out a way to deal with money that everyone's cool about, we're not going to either. But we can still strive to do better. And it's important that we do so because having more financial resources will help us to address a lot of these other ongoing issues. So what's the current status quo in FOSS? There's actually a number of ways that you can get paid to develop FOSS. There are businesses, for instance, Red Hat, that create entirely free projects and sell support services for them. There are FOSS frameworks like Django, WordPress, Drupal, etc., who support a robust economy based on customization. There are tech companies who pay employees to contribute to FOSS projects, such as the Linux kernel. And there are nonprofits and similar organizations which get funding through grants and donations and therefore don't need to worry about monetizing their products. And these options cover a lot of people. If you are interested in getting paid to work in free software, there are definitely opportunities you should pursue. However, the majority of FOSS contributions are still unpaid. And this isn't inherently a problem. There are a lot of people who enjoy giving their time and their efforts to the wider community, but there are still some practical problems. For instance, the work of newcomers is almost always uncompensated. And this means that people who are not financially privileged enough to work for free don't get to participate in free software, which provides a great big filtering effect for the economic diversity of our community. There are some organizations which work to address this disparity, including, as I mentioned before, Google Summer of Code, Project Ascend, and Outreachy. Another issue is time. Some people can't contribute to free software as a hobby. People who have health issues, people who care for dependents, people who work multiple jobs or go to school full-time and work simply don't have the space to contribute to free software unless it's taking the role of work in their lives. Another issue is which kind of work gets compensated. We're stuck in a bit of a vicious cycle in that we value coding over teaching, design, and other kinds of work. And because we value them more, we're more likely to pay people to work on them. And because we're more likely to pay people to work on them, we get to see the potential of code to make changes in a way that we don't for teaching or design or some of these other ways to contribute. And because we get to see their potential in action, we value them more, and because we value them more, we pay people more, circle. Now, some people instinctively dislike the idea of paying people for cost contributions. Again, I understand this perspective. Let's look again at values. These people see free software as a kind of gift economy. Each contribution is a gift to the community, and it thrives on reciprocity. Paying people would warp things, and that's a reasonable fear. In psychology, we call this motivational crowding. If you give little kids a task and then start rewarding some of the kids for the task, those that get rewarded will be less enthusiastic about doing the task when they don't have a reward. Another example of this is they did a study with daycare providers who were having trouble with parents picking up students late. They said, all right, we're going to impose a fine. And the people, once they imposed the fine, the parents were even later because they figured, oh, well, I'm paying for to come late. And they no longer felt that they needed to empathize with the inconvenience they were causing the daycare providers. So, like, I get it. Money can warp things. There's another element at play here, which is fairness. Why should some people get paid while other people give away their work? So this is partially just an excuse to show you a picture of some cute monkeys, but there's a point. At the monkey lab I worked at, a graduate student did a study with monkeys who were given cucumbers in exchange for doing tasks. And so, I think it was giving them a rock. So you'd give a monkey a cucumber, or you hold out your hand, the monkey would put a rock into your hand, and you give it a cucumber, and it'd be like sweet. And then so whenever you held out your hand, it would give you a rock. So they did this, and then they gave one of the monkeys a cucumber, and then they gave the next monkey a grape. Can you imagine a grape? Then they went back to the first monkey and gave it a cucumber, and the monkey was like, no. If that monkey gets a grape, I'm getting a grape. It didn't say that, but it did throw the cucumber on the floor. I looked for a GIF of this and couldn't find it, but my slides link to the YouTube video. So if you want to see the angry, morally outraged monkey throw a cucumber on the floor, just go to my slides. Okay, so what is the point of that? We primates care a lot about fairness. These are like very fundamental values. The thing, though, is that arguments for paying people to contribute to free software can also be made in the name of fairness and community. If everyone was the same, then a gift of an hour of time or 50 lines of code or 100 words of documentation would be the same. But people are different, and they come from different backgrounds and have different constraints. An hour of time from someone who is struggling to pay the rent is very different from an hour of time from someone who would otherwise just spend the evening playing video games. Community in turn is promoted by protecting the security and happiness of community members and embracing the diversity that financial compensation allows. So basically we all want the same thing. We want a happy community where everyone is treated fairly, but fear and a failure to empathize have us arguing past each other. Of course, even if we all did agree on the importance of paying people, it might be difficult to put into practice. For all that there are opportunities for paid work in free software, we don't have a robust model that everyone can use. There are many important projects that are underfunded and many people who are in FOSS who want paying work who don't currently have it. Consequently, there are some people who create and release software that is not precisely free, yet shares some of our values. For instance, some projects release their source code but don't license people to reuse it. Others create systems which are only mostly open but retain certain elements as proprietary. There are people that argue for a sort of purity of free software purpose, and I empathize with that as well. But I also empathize with those who want to experiment with different models. Free software exists within a greater economic system, and until there's a universal basic income for everybody, I have great sympathy for those who are struggling to marry together information freedom, software freedom, and financial security. I also just want to take a moment to clarify that there's a difference between a project choosing not to freely license software they've developed and projects taking freely licensed software and then using it and not contributing their changes back. And I greatly appreciate the Free Software Conservancy and people like Karen Sandler who try to prevent the latter. So with that caveat, I want to say experiment away. And there are a number of organizations listed here that are trying to experiment. So just to go over them, there's a bunch of paid internships and fellowships. I've listed a few before, but there's something like 16 or 18 of them listed on a wiki page if you follow one of those links. There's crowdfunding platforms like Snowdrift, as well as things like Patreon and Indiegogo. There's a science crowdfunding experiment, experiment.com, which is pretty cool. Grant-making organizations like the Knight Foundation, Sunlight Foundation, Wikimedia, Shuttleworth. Fundraising drives by individual projects. There's a ton of these. I'm just going to shout out the Python Software Foundation and Django because they're some of my favorites. There are companies that sponsor projects. So for instance, the Linux Foundation, a bunch of companies fairly recently after Heartbleed have started to get together to support OpenSSL. Stripe does something called an open source retreat. And there's also some sort of like even more experimental ways of funding FOSS. For instance, yesterday at Paige Peterson's talk, I learned about MadeSafe, which uses cryptocurrency tokens to fund their work. There's also Bounty Source, which is like an open source bounty system. So there are people who are really experimenting in this space and trying to figure this out. More power to them. My fourth and final bug report of the day, expected behavior. People of all backgrounds and demographics use and contribute to free software. Actual behavior. Free software is disproportionately white, male, financially secure, and highly educated. I don't need to tell you that free software is less diverse than the general population. And although we lack good recent data, we know that upper and middle class white men are overrepresented. Now, I've met people who say they value diversity and yet don't support diversity initiatives. These people want to live in a world where we interact with each other based on interest and skills alone, rather than irrelevant factors like race, gender, religion, orientation, and age. I sympathize with this. I too want to live in that world. They see this as a pro-diversity stance, that anyone from any demographic can join their project and be treated the same. I'm going to introduce yet another metaphor here. I love metaphors. How many people here have heard of a leaky abstraction? Maybe like a third of people. So this is a term that was popularized in 2002 by Joel Sapolsky. So in software, we're constantly trying to abstract our code and our design to get rid of unnecessary complexity and make things as simple as possible. A leaky abstraction is when that complexity surprisingly seeps back in. I told you could put any string into my search box, but you put in, like, say, a hyphen into an airline. Not that this hasn't happened to me within the last week, and it chokes on it and says you can't use that. That's a leaky abstraction. You told me that you were going to take care of my data, and it would be somewhere in the world, but I shouldn't even think about where in the world it was, but it was in a place where there's a lot of flooding, and the data center flooded, and my data is gone. That is a literal leaky abstraction. According to Sapolsky, all non-trivial abstractions are leaky in some ways. People who want to treat everybody the same are using an abstraction that's leaking all over the place. They want to assume everyone is equal, but they're not, due to systematic discrimination and oppression. Even if you do manage to treat everyone the same, which is really difficult due to unconscious biases, you've got trouble upstream. Now, you should never assume that a specific member of a marginalized group has had specific experiences, but on the whole, people from certain groups tend to experience the world differently in certain ways than other groups. And this provides both different vulnerabilities and strengths. For example, someone who's grown up in poverty might have a much better understanding of how to use technology to increase access to government services. Someone who's socialized female may understand how to build a more cooperative, productive environment. Someone who's been the victim of interpersonal or state violence may be quicker to grasp the potential of a new technology to be abused. Someone who's older may be able to better remember the last time a particular trend came around and whether it was worth following up on. Someone who's differently abled may be able to recognize when a design decision renders a project inaccessible to a portion of users. And someone who speaks multiple languages may be able to see when a concept has not been translated well between the languages. These differences of experience are important because diversity is not just numbers on a page, and diversity work doesn't end just when you get a certain number of people from an underrepresented group to join your project. And so this means doing the hard work of tackling ongoing problems, such as, for instance, lack of childcare at conferences, offensive languages in chat rooms and on mailing lists, a culture of interruption which disproportionately silences women and non-native speakers. I gave a talk on that last one if you're interested. But just as importantly, it means providing resources and support to people who are doing outreach to their own communities. I'm a huge fan of the work that Kendra Moyer has done in Boston, reaching out to people in low-income communities and showing them about free software and how to use it. I want to share something she wrote to me about the disconnect she often sees when people try to do outreach to those communities. The free software movement is basically entrenched in white European male, The free software movement is basically too entrenched in white European male academic culture to do the maximum productive outreach to non-traditional communities that are less technically inclined. This disconnect is rooted in larger societal problems around access to education and the long-term industrial shift from the blue collar to the tech worker as the new middle class. The solution is for people of color to take up the responsibility to bridge these gaps where at all possible to bring the technology to new spaces. Unfortunately, Kendra recently had to move away from Boston, which is rapidly gentrifying. She couldn't continue volunteering her time, and she couldn't find anyone to pay her for doing this work, however passionate she was about bringing free software to these communities. Conversely, I personally got paid to run outreach events at colleges like Harvard and Princeton. Now, Open Edge also runs events at public schools, community colleges, and other places that serve underrepresented communities, and I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with paying me to run outreach at Princeton. It's just in the context of this pattern of undervaluing diversity that it's a problem, and I want to see that pattern change. I'm going to close out this particular bug report by highlighting groups who are doing outreach to underrepresented and marginalized communities. I want to encourage all of you to support these people with your voices and, if you can, with your wallets. There's another term for leaky abstractions, by the way, and it's called intersectionality. I was worried when I wrote this talk that it would come across as too negative, too focused on problems and flaws. But I remember something that I've said many times at outreach events to newcomers who are worried about making bug reports. They come across a confusing piece of documentation, missing requirement in the install instructions, a broken link, and they're worried that leaving a bug report will be seen as an insult or a demand. But they're not. A proper bug report is just an offering. They're an act of respect and appreciation for a project. Just as this talk is an offering, an act of respect and appreciation for the free software community as a whole. It's an act of faith on my part. Faith that this free software community can gain widespread support and acceptance. Faith that we can be usable and easy to contribute to. That we can be diverse and welcoming, and that we can find ways to financially support each other. That we can act in collaboration and stand in solidarity with other communities that share our values, and that we can be a radiant example of those values, leading the way onward. It's a hell of a challenge, I'll admit. It's going to be hard and it'll take time, and we'll make mistakes and get stuck and have so many disagreements, I'm sure. But I'm an idealist. I think a lot of us here are idealists, and an engineer. And challenges like this should make our hearts sing. Beneath the code, the heart, the radiant singing heart. Also some resources and some thanks. And I'll bring us back to the first slide, which has a link to these slides if you want to